Spotting Allied fighters a few miles away, the leader turned, just as the enemy turned to intercept. The Japanese mission leader began signaling his planes, and the leader of this strike was Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano, commander of the 1st Squadron of the 204th Air Group. He was a highly experienced fighter pilot. He had fought in the Aleutians before coming to Rabaul. He led 25 Zeros from the 204th Air Group, plus 70 more from the 582nd Group and 251st Group. The Allied unit consisted of about 60 planes from Guadalcanal, Marine F-4 use, Army Air Corps P-38s and P-39s, Navy F-4Fs and New Zealand P-40s. The Japanese immediately split up into battle formations, and in a few minutes the opposing forces met. The large formations quickly broke down into flights of 4 planes and attack units of 2 planes, and, as was becoming ever more evident, with this technique, the Allied flyers excelled. Of necessity, they had learned that the way to fight Zeros was to keep formation. The time was 5 minutes after 11, Tokyo time, and the fight could not last more than an hour. The Japanese didn't have enough fuel to prolong the combat. Actually, it lasted considerably less. Lieutenant Miyano and a force of 3 Zeros sat above the conflict, directing and, when necessary, swooping down to help some Zero in trouble. Miyano kept an eye on his fuel indicator, and when the critical moment came, he broke off the engagement, formed up his aircraft, and headed back to Rabaul. When the pilots arrived at the debriefing, the attack force claimed to have won. They had, said Lieutenant Miyano, accomplished precisely what they set out to do. And what was that mission, seemingly so aimless? It was the mission that had been entrusted to the Rabaul Air Force by Admiral Yamamoto to destroy Allied air might in the southern Solomons so that the Japanese effort in New Guinea could proceed without hindrance from that quarter. Lieutenant Miyano's report said that both sides combined put about 130 planes into the air that day over Guadalcanal, and the Japanese returned home in complete victory, having shot down 41 American aircraft. That was not the American recollection. American and New Zealand pilots that day claimed 16 Japanese planes with a loss of half a dozen of their own. What the battle showed was the continued reliance of the Japanese air forces on outmoded tactics. The arrival of the P-38 in the Solomons changed the whole air war. Yamamoto had been aware of the improving quality of the American fighting equipment, and he had commented that he was very much more concerned about that than about the quality of the American fighting men. But the fact was that both the equipment and the men were becoming more effective at the arts of war. There was very little the Japanese could do about it, given their limited production capacity. They could and did produce growing numbers of aircraft at home, but that production was based on the use of existing dies. The aircraft manufacturers were continually improving the existing aircraft. For example, Admiral Yamamoto's last bomber had been given a much longer range. It could travel 2,300 miles. But introduction of entirely new types was another matter, and for all practical purposes, the Japanese would fight the entire war with the same weapons with which they had started. The Americans, on the other hand, were constantly improving their aircraft. When the war began, the P-38 did not exist, nor did the P-51, which also would make its appearance in Pacific waters, nor the F-6F, which went into 5 versions, each improved over the last, nor the torpedo bomber, nor the Black Cat radar-controlled night fighter. These new aircraft were beginning to come into the American Air Forces, along with the B-25 medium bomber and the A-20 attack bomber. In 1943, the changes came very fast. The Japanese pilots became indisputably aware of that fact early in June, when observers over the Russell Islands noted that the Americans had completed 2 airfields there and that both housed marine fighters. The shocking part was that the Japanese bombers had been claiming they were interdicting the American supply lines, and obviously this was untrue. Lieutenant Miyano came back to his unit's base at Rabaul's eastern airfield with a suggestion for new tactics. Since the bombers had failed to stop the building of the airfields, the fighters undertake the destruction of the fields and the aircraft on the ground. He wanted the Zeros equipped with wing racks to carry 130-pound bombs. The suggestion met with the usual opposition from ordnance officers and purists, but the fact was that some new tactic had to be tried. So the group commander agreed to let Lieutenant Miyano have his way, and on June 7, when the next big mission took place, 2 Zeros were so equipped. They would fly in with the other fighters, and then, while the others lured the Americans aloft, the bombing Zeros would try their luck. On this day, 81 Zeros from the 582nd and 251st Air Groups were employed. They flew down across the Russells, as was their usual tactic, this time heading from north to south across the islands. There were the airfields below, and indeed they were operational. It seemed unbelievable to the Japanese that the change could have occurred so quickly, and the implications were not lost. From this time on, the relatively short-range Scout Bomber 2C dive bombers and F-4F and F-4U fighters could reach Buin when equipped with auxiliary gas tanks. For the first time, the Americans had the ability to strike hard at the interior Japanese bases. Perhaps, the optimistic fighter pilots thought, they could succeed where the bombers had failed. The experimental fighter bombers had excellent protection. As they came in over the southern Russell Island airfield, 3 other Zeros were on their left and 4 on their right. The other fighters moved on, high, and continued to look for the enemy, and the bombing planes moved slowly down to carry out their mission. Suddenly, a pair of P-38s flashed in between them and their escorts. The escorting fighters had let just a little too much distance develop between them and their charges, and the bombing planes were shot down. The new tactic turned out to be a complete failure. That day the melee became general, and once again a swarm of Allied aircraft of half a dozen varieties rose up to meet the enemy. Generally speaking, the P-40 was not much of a match for the Zero. It did not have the climbing speed, the range, or the altitude capability of the Japanese plane. But in a scrap at low altitude, the P-40 was a plane to reckon with, and that day a dozen of them from the 44th Fighter Squadron were involved. The Allied planes did well. They shot down 23 Zeros, or about 30% of the force that had come down the slot. The Allies lost 9 planes, and all the pilots were recovered. That was one advantage of fighting above your own territory. In this springtime of 1943, the attrition among Japanese naval pilots was becoming one of the most difficult problems the Rabaul Air Fleet Command had to face. A few, such as Lieutenant Miyano and Warrant Officer Ryoji Ohara, seemed to have charmed lives. Miyano had participated in the original airstrikes against Clark Field in the Philippines. He had served aboard the carrier Junyo, with skill enough to merit one of the Japanese Fleet Air Arm's rare promotions. Ohara had flown from Buin. He had fought in many of the Guadalcanal and New Guinea battles. On May 13, he had been involved with a pair of F-4U fighters and had shot them down, then made a forced landing at Kolombangara. He had been in the middle of the fracas with the P-38s that day and escaped unscathed. Another very skillful pilot was Ensign Yoshio Oki of the 251st Fighter Group. He had already shot down a dozen enemy planes and had served a tour of duty in New Guinea, had then been returned to Japan for treatment of wounds, and was now on his second South Pacific tour. The dreadful disaster of the convoy to Leh, the death of Yamamoto, and the sure knowledge that more and better Allied aircraft were arriving constantly in the South Pacific brought a subtle change to the morale of the Japanese flyers. They now spoke of the air lane between Rabaul and Guadalcanal as Cemetery Alley, and sometimes of their aircraft as flying coffins. There was no more talk about ever-victorious forces around the airfields. There was no shirking. The flyers went out day after day as bravely as ever and fought as hard as ever, but many of them now considered themselves to be doomed. They had no hope of seeing their homeland again. Morale was lifted with the arrival of an improved version of the Aichi dive bomber. The Americans called the new arrivals Vals. The pilots felt they had a little better chance of survival in the new planes, and some new Zeros were also coming down the pipeline from Japan. They were faster and had a longer range than the Model 11 that many of the pilots had been flying. Still, the designers and factories were producing basically the same sort of aircraft as before, fast and manoeuvrable, but extremely vulnerable. Probably there was no way to make a basic change to protect the pilots without sacrificing the Zero's best qualities. The new Zeros, like the old, burned with the ferocity of welding torches once they were hit in the vitals. Early in June, the 204th Air Group got a dozen of the new Zeros. The shipment was part of the build-up for the new air war Admiral Koga had decreed to advance the Japanese cause in the Solomons and New Guinea. The 204th also got a new commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Tomo Oyama. This officer's arrival was indicative of the Japanese Naval Air Force's biggest problem: adequately trained personnel. Lieutenant Commander Oyama had been fighting for a long time. His experience went back to the early days of the war in China. He had flown a fighter in the initial attack on Clark Field in the Philippines, and had served in that entire campaign, and he had also fought in the Celebes, Borneo, Java and Timor. He had then been sent back to Japan to become a test pilot. Now he was coming back to the front to fight again, because the Navy needed experienced men. The new Zeros had an immediate impact on morale, and on June 3, several of the most experienced pilots escorted a flight of bombers out of Buin in an attack on Guadalcanal. There were 24 Zeros in the force that day. They ran into several packs of F-4Us and F-4Fs and came home to claim 6 American planes shot down with no losses to themselves. The American record does not bear out any such one-sided victory, but as usual, pilots in combat are not very good judges of such matters. Elated by the victory of June 3rd, the pilots of the 204th Fighter Group returned to Guadalcanal the next day. In fact, they would be fighting almost steadily for the next 12 days, along with the 251st Fighter Group and the 582nd Fighter Group, either around Guadalcanal or over New Guinea. Then came June 16, which was to go down in the Rabaul records as one of the bloodiest and most disastrous days of the whole war for the Zero squadrons. The Japanese were waiting to deal a decisive blow to the American build-up they had been watching in the Russells and at Guadalcanal, where Admiral Kelly Turner's amphibious landing organization was operating out of a camp near Lunga Point. As the Japanese observation planes reported, something was about to break. There were too many American cargo ships in the harbour, and just too much activity for the lull in the land war to continue. Admiral Koga hoped to head off an American invasion of the Central Solomons by prompt and decisive action. After wearing out the Americans by attrition, he would then launch an attack of his own, combined with an army move, win a fleet engagement, retake Guadalcanal, and force the Americans to the peace table. If that plan sounds peculiarly like one of Admiral Yamamoto's, why it was. Admiral Koga was a disciple of Yamamoto. The next Japanese effort, he said, was to be a major attack on the 4 major airfields on Guadalcanal and in the Russells and destruction of the vessels lined up in Lunga roads. On June 10, a troop convoy was spotted by Japanese search planes. This convoy aroused the pilots' interest because the scouts also saw a carrier. She was the escort carrier Suwane, and like all carriers, a prize coveted by the Japanese Navy pilots. A strike from Rabaul sent 6 twin-engine bombers to attack the carrier, but all of them were shot down that day by American fighters from Guadalcanal. Later in the day, Admiral Kusaka's 11th Air Fleet sent a much larger force to sink the carrier and the 6 transports she protected. More than 60 Zeros escorted 24 dive bombers to make the attack, but the coast watchers, the radar, and the American fighter pilots were waiting for them. The Japanese fighters did their job magnificently, sacrificing themselves to let the bombers get through. But when the bombers did get through the American fighter screen, they found the anti-aircraft guns on Guadalcanal and aboard the ships took a heavy toll, and only 6 bombers got anywhere near the targets with their ordnance. The cargo ship Solano was hit twice and was so badly damaged that she had to be beached, but at least she did not sink. Landing ship Tank 340 was badly hit, and the soldiers she carried were ordered to swim for shore. But as the attack wound down, 2 other landing ship tanks came up with firefighting equipment, and they managed to save the vessel. Few of the Japanese fighters and fewer of the bombers got home that day. One pilot reported exuberantly that they had sunk all 6 of the transports, but the next morning the scout planes reported the true situation off Lunga Point. The big ships were all still there, unhurt. 2 days later, the Japanese tried again. Another 12 bombers came down the slot, escorted by about 30 fighters. Again, the effort was repulsed by the flyers from Guadalcanal, with heavy losses for the Japanese, but Admiral Kusaka did not quit. Before dawn on June 16, the Japanese scout planes were over Guadalcanal, and they reported seeing 5 large transports and 28 smaller vessels in the open sea between Cape Esperance and the southern tip of the Bustles. At Rabaul, Japanese intelligence recognized the signs of a forthcoming invasion effort, and at 11th Air Fleet headquarters, the orders went out. This would be the day for the big air battle. The weather could not have been better for flying that morning. The sun came up in a cloudless sky, and there was virtually no wind. It was hot already, the middle of the hot season, but no one noticed it. The whole Rabaul base was alive with excitement, for this great battle had been a topic of conversation for weeks. After all the casualties the 11th Air Fleet had taken in the past 2 weeks, all the Japanese pilots knew that many would not come back that day, but they were all resigned, even lifted to a sort of exaltation by realization of the nearness of death. They lined up on the runways beside their planes. The ground crews came out and delivered box lunches and soda pop, 3 bottles per man, and they made ready to take off. At 10 o'clock, 24 dive bombers from the 582nd Bombardment Group took off, followed by 48 Zero fighters from the 204th and 582 fighter groups. They would be climbing to gain altitude all the way to Buka, where they would link up with 25 fighters from the 251st Group, making one attack formation of nearly 100 planes. They would fly high above the Solomon Sea, to Guadalcanal to destroy the Allied flotilla. Lieutenant Miyano was leading the 204th fighters in their watch over the bombers. Over the sea as they approached Guadalcanal, he noticed that 2 of his fighters were having trouble because they had throttled back so tightly to maintain speed with the slower bombers. There was nothing below them but water, and it was many miles to the nearest friendly territory. If they went into the sea, then it meant 2 more airmen lost. Miyano ordered the bombers to speed up. When one plane began to lose power and sink towards the sea, Miyano dropped down to head the pilot toward Colombangara Island, the last possible field for an emergency landing. The mission went on. Miyano led his fighters all the way, and when the ships came in sight, he would give the order to attack. At 12:30 a.m., the Japanese force was over the Russells. The warnings went out at Henderson Field, and American fighter pilots began to scramble for their planes. Soon they were in the air. P-38s, P-40s, F-4Fs, F-4Us, and even some vintage P-39s, which could be effective only at a low level. The 339th Fighter Squadron made the first contact with Miyano's force. Lieutenant Murray J. Shubin was leading a flight of 4 P-38s northward when he spotted the big Japanese formation 15 miles from the western end of Guadalcanal. Here, the altitude capability of the P-38 proved an advantage. The Japanese were coming in at 24,000 feet, but the P-38s were at 27,000 feet, prime position for an attack. Lieutenant Shubin did not wait for reinforcements. He led his flight down in a charge on the last dozen Zeros. The Americans came from above and behind the Japanese, and when they reached firing range, they began shooting. That first surge knocked out 5 Zeros before they could react. Then, one by one, the P-38s were also hit, or ran out of ammunition and zoomed away from the battle. This action was of the sort that led the Japanese to believe that they were shooting down Allied planes when they were not. Actually, at the end of 15 minutes, all the P-38s had left the battle except Shubin's. He continued to fight for another 40 minutes, and in a series of furious battles, shot down 3 more planes and damaged another. That one P-38 accounted for at least 5 Japanese Zeros that day. It was no wonder that the men of the 11th Air Fleet had such high regard for the P-38 with its 20mm cannon. By the time Shubin left the scene, scores of other Allied planes had joined the battle, coming up from the 3 Guadalcanal and 2 Russells airstrips. 21 P-40s from Henderson Field got off the ground shortly after the P-38s met the enemy up north. By the time these United States planes were airborne, the Japanese dive bombers had arrived over Guadalcanal and were preparing to attack the ships in Lunga Roads. The P-40s and 2 flights of P-39s began to work over the dive bombers. The Zeros peeled off to meet the threat and took most of the punishment, so that the bombers would have a chance at their targets. By this time, the fight had moved out over the channel between Lunga Roads and Tulagi as the bombers went after the shipping. Lieutenant Miyano was leading, watching and directing, and Warrant Officer Sugida's Zero was just behind him. Suddenly out of nowhere appeared an F-4F. The pilot put one short burst into Miyano's Zero, and it nosed over, burst into flame, and crashed into the sea. Warrant Officer Sugida took over leadership of the mission and somehow got the survivors back to Rabaul. A number of planes dropped off at Kolombangara Island to make emergency landings. The Allied planes did not pursue, having used much of their fuel in the aerobatics of fighting. The Japanese came home from the raid sad because of Miyano's death, but not dispirited. They claimed to have sunk 6 transports. Actually, they had hit 3 and done considerable damage to them and to shore installations. The Japanese also admitted to heavy casualties. The Americans claimed to have shot down 66 of the 100 Japanese planes, with a loss of 6 Allied aircraft. But the fact is that the raid was not a failure by the Japanese standards of the day. By American standards, it was damaging, but not as damaging as the Japanese believed it to be. Another factor had entered the Pacific War equation. The American industrial machine was in full gear, and more war material was being sent to the Pacific than before. Therefore, in terms of replacement possibility, the Japanese damage on this and other raids was much less meaningful than it would have been had the positions been reversed, and the Japanese belief in the success was not pretense. Lieutenant Miyano was mourned throughout the 11th Air Fleet. Further, he received one of the most meaningful of Japanese Navy accolades posthumously. He was promoted 2 grades to become Commander Miyano. It was a very real honour in a service where promotions were sparse. He had flown 228 missions and shot down 16 Allied planes, and he had been shot down by a tyro in one of those flukes of war. The death of this highly competent and experienced fighter pilot was indicative of the Japanese naval aviation problem that would grow worse each month. The best men were dying as the Allied plane strength increased by great leaps. The Japanese plane production machinery was just about keeping up, but the air training program was not producing pilots fast enough to replace the dead. The big raid of June 16 marked the end of the Japanese 11th Air Fleet effort to halt the American move north. The truth was that temporarily the attack potential of the Rabaul Air Force was nearly exhausted. As of June 20, the fleet had been reduced from the high point reached in the spring to 53 twin-engine Betty bombers, 13 Val dive bombers, and 83 Zeros. Admiral Koga's air offensive, really a continuation of Admiral Yamamoto's Operation 1, had come to an end. It had failed to slow Admiral Halsey's progress. For the first time since the beginning of the Pacific War, the Allies were on the offensive. After the fall of Guadalcanal, Admiral Halsey proceeded in an unhurried fashion to prepare for the attack up the Solomon Chain, while General MacArthur did the same in New Guinea. The Japanese regarded what was happening as a breathing spell. That was a major miscalculation. All the while the Allies seemed to be resting. They were bringing tens of thousands of tons of supplies and tens of thousands of new and rested troops into the South and Southwest Pacific to carry on the 1943 operations. To be sure, the Russells were taken with a very mixed invasion force, but that was the last of such operations. The planning for the invasion of New Georgia was thorough and leisurely as such things went. The first objectives were to be 4 spots in the New Georgia area, to be taken for their tactical value in the main invasion. One was Wickham Anchorage on the southeast coast of Little Vangunu Island. This would become a fuel station for PT boats and other small craft from the Guadalcanal area. The second objective was Segi Point on the south coast of New Georgia, which the CBs were to turn into a fighter strip in short order. That would eliminate the need for long flights from Henderson Field or from the fighter strips on Guadalcanal and the Russells. Third, Viru Harbour, up the coast from Segi Point, would become a safe harbour for the small vessels. Fourth, Renova Island, across the Blanche Channel from New Georgia, was large enough to become a PT boat and artillery base. The plans were made in February, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the operation at the end of March, and in April and May a steady stream of materials began moving up from Noumea, and later directly from Pearl Harbor and the United States. The ships came first to Lunga Roads. Then many of them were sent on to the Russells, which was 80 miles closer to the objective. The Japanese, as noted, had watched the steady build-up of the Russells' bases when they flew over during their many air raids on Guadalcanal. On the islands of Pavuvu and Banica, the Americans built their PT boat advanced base. At the end of May, a number of boats moved up there nightly. They ran patrols up to New Georgia. That spring, the harassment of the Japanese in the Central Solomons became a way of life, one that Admiral Halsey found most satisfying because of the results. One night early in May, 4 destroyers moved into Blackett Strait, which runs between Kolombangara Island, where the Japanese had many troops, and Arundel Island. The strait was part of the primary route for Japanese supply ships bringing troops and supplies to Kolombangara. The destroyers were the Radford Breeze, Gamble, and Preble. The last 3 were old 4-stack coal burners, nearly obsolete for such tasks as convoy or submarine hunting, but valuable nonetheless, as they showed on this mission. The task was to lay mines in Blackett Strait. On May 7, they laid 250 mines between the Gizo Reefs and Kolombangara. 2 days later, the Japanese destroyers Oyashio, Kurashio, Kagero, and Mikishio set out on a resupply mission to the south. As they had done many times before, they came down through Blackett Strait, but when they reached the middle of the strait, the first 3 destroyers struck mines. The Kurashio hit so many that she sank. The Kagero and Oyashio caught fire and lost power. The Michishio began rescue operations. An Allied coast watcher spotted the ships from shore and sent a message that brought a 60-plane airstrike from Guadalcanal the next morning. Most of the planes failed to find the target because of bad weather, but about 20 got through. The Kagero sank after colliding with mines, but the enemy planes sank the crippled Oyashio. The loss of life was 85 men for the Oyashio, 81 for the Kurashio, and 18 for the Kagero. The Michishio escaped with some damage and returned to Rabaul. These were just the latest Japanese ships to suffer from American offensive mining operations. Mines laid in Kavieng, Buin, and Munda all brought more Japanese casualties. The destroyer Kazagumo was damaged by American mines while moving through what had previously been safe waters. A number of merchant ships were sunk or damaged. Several I-boats that disappeared during this period may have fallen victim to the mines. The fact was that by May 1943, there were no more safe waters for the Japanese fleet south of Truk. Still, the Japanese continued to move men and supplies, by destroyer, by submarine, and by barge to New Georgia and Kolombangara, and by road and trail on the islands. Belatedly, in May, the Japanese Southeast Command at Rabaul began to recognize the immediacy of the need for heavier reinforcement. Even then, they had not gotten used to the idea that this war in the South Pacific was going to be fought in terms of divisions and not battalions. Early in May, General Imamura sent Major General Minoru Sasaki down to New Georgia with the title of Commanding General, Southeast Area Detachment. Sasaki was a highly trained and highly regarded member of the officer corps. He was then 50 years old, and his career had begun in the cavalry. He had studied in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and in Poland. He had gone to Army General Staff School, served in the very important Military Affairs Bureau of the War Department, which actually made Army policy, and in 1936 had joined the Army General Staff. Since his promotion to Major General in 1939, he had served in the field continuously until 1942, when he again went to Tokyo as head of the Mechanized Department of the Army. From this post he came south to take over the defense of New Georgia, and on his insistence, the flow of supplies and men increased sharply. When the Allies became aware of this new Japanese policy, Admiral Halsey ordered bombardment of the Japanese bases at Vila and Munda. The first attack was carried out on May 12. The bombardments were successful only in the sense that none of the Allied ships was sunk. They stood offshore first at Vila and then at Munda and fired away for several hours, using up 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The damage to Japanese installations was minimal. Mine layers came along and laid more mines in Kula Gulf, and like the bombardment, the mine laying was uneventful. But there were some accidents, as aboard the cruiser Nashville when a shell exploded inside a gun turret, killing several men and wounding several more. and the mines the force laid were effective no more than 1 day before the Japanese swept them up. The mine-laying had hurt the Japanese when it came as a total surprise, but after the initial surprises, the Japanese brought more minesweepers down from Truk, and the mine damage ceased. The results of such operations were not productive, as Admiral Nimitz saw immediately when he reviewed the action reports of the units involved. He ordered Halsey to stop the marginal operations and get on with the invasion of the Central Solomons. Halsey already had the idea, his operation plan was drawn, and he was nearly ready to go, and the plan had the great virtue of simplicity. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was told to start working up the Solomons chain. He was not told how to do it. In essence, Halsey gave the ball to Admiral Turner and told him to run with it. One of Admiral Halsey's peculiarities of operation was that he insisted on maintaining tactical control of his forces, although he remained at Noumea. That was not as difficult as it may seem, because radio communications kept the Admiral in constant touch with events, and that was the way he wanted it. Turner was named commander of Task Force 31, which consisted of big transports of the President class. President Hayes, President Jackson, President Adams, plus a number of landing ship tanks, destroyers, minesweepers, and smaller invasion craft such as tank landing crafts, infantry landing crafts, patrol boats, PT boats. 3 infantry units were part of the force too. A Western Landing Force, built around the Army 43rd Infantry Regiment, and an Eastern Landing Force, built around the Army 103rd Infantry Regiment, and a reserve of Marine Raiders. The 2nd Marine Air Wing would be responsible for getting planes into New Georgia as soon as possible and operating out of there. The whole invasion area would be generally protected and policed by Task Force 36, the battleships, carriers, cruisers and destroyers of the 3rd Fleet, which Halsey kept under his own direct command. Kelly Turner's mission was stated very simply. This force will, first on D-Day, capture Renova Island, the Viru Harbour, Segi Point and Wickham anchorage areas, capture or destroy enemy garrisons, and develop these positions for offensive operations. Second, at the first favourable opportunity thereafter, when directed by the Commander 3rd Fleet, capture in succession Munda, Kolombangara, and other enemy positions in the New Georgia Group, and capture or destroy enemy garrisons. Third, the purpose of these operations is to prepare for further operations up the Solomons. Had the Japanese been given an advance look at Admiral Halsey's orders, they would have thought the Americans were crazy. No one, except the Russians in Manchuria, had ever stood up to the Imperial Army for long. The events of the last months of 1942 had occasioned some changes in the thinking of Japanese officers in the South Pacific, but they had made little impression on the staff officers who manned the Imperial General Headquarters, most of whom had never commanded an army or navy unit in battle. Even after the defeats at Ruin and Guadalcanal, General Tojo's government still believed that the war could and would be won. Admiral Kusaka, the overall commander of the South Pacific for the Japanese, and General Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, saw what was coming. On May 22, the Navy's aerial scouts had counted 278 planes on Guadalcanal. Over several weeks they had noted and reported on the constant build-up of the bases. General Imamura sent word to Admiral Koga at Truk that reinforcements and supplies were needed vitally, and he got them. During the month of June, 3 transports began to ply busily between Truk and the Central Solomons bases, bringing in about 1,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. On June 27, Imamura dispatched reinforcements to Kolombangara. The bulk of 1 battalion of the Army 13th Infantry Regiment was delivered to the island by the destroyers Mochizuki, Yonage, and Satsuki that night without incident, and that meant another 800 defenders. But the Americans were aware of the reinforcement, and the next day, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the new unit had its baptism of fire when 48 American bombers attacked Munda Airfield. They destroyed a number of installations and 2 anti-aircraft guns. The anti-aircraft gunners claimed to have shot down 5 Allied planes. Then, at 7 o'clock on the night of June 29, Munda Airfield was shelled by 2 United States destroyers. Even so, That same night, the destroyers Nagatsuki and Minazuki delivered more troops and ammunition to Kolombangara. They also delivered the regimental commander, Colonel Tomonori, who arrived with regimental flags flying. It was apparent at Munda, and the word was passed to Rabaul, that an invasion was imminent, but the old ways died hard. The Japanese referred to what was coming as a Hanko counterattack, and technically speaking that was correct. The Japanese had occupied these islands at the end of 1941, so any attack now was counterattack. But the Army and Navy thinking was still overshadowed by vestiges of the past. It was hard to forget the days when the Imperial forces rolled up one victory after another. The self-deception inherent in the use of the word counterattack was one thing, but military hyperbole was invoked with predictions of crushing blows and annihilation of the enemy. Whatever they called the movement that was coming from Guadalcanal, the troubles of the Japanese in the Solomons were just beginning. The first move in the invasion of the Central Solomons occurred on June 20, and in a sense it was inadvertent. Segi Point at the southeastern end of New Georgia was regarded as enormously important to the Allied plans for the next few weeks. Here the Seabees would rush in to build an airfield to take the pressure off Guadalcanal and the Russells. For several weeks before the invasion, small parties had slipped in and out of the area, often by submarine, to make contact with the local coast watchers and familiarize themselves with the terrain. The Japanese were well aware of the activity, but were unable to stop it. Around the middle of June, the activity became so noticeable that the Japanese garrison commander at Viru sent a large detachment southeast over the mountains to capture and hold Segi Point, then to build an airstrip there. But the resident Allied coast watcher, D.G. Kennedy, had already proved to be as much a guerrilla fighter as a watcher. He kept a schooner in a little bay and had been known to fight pitched battles with Japanese patrol craft. He maintained a force of local warriors who had remained loyal to Britain throughout the year and a half of Japanese occupation. They had ambushed small parties of Japanese from time to time, and when Kennedy learned from the island telegraph that the Japanese were coming, he prepared to ambush this party as well. He did so, killed a number of the Japanese and scattered the rest, and captured the notebook of Major Hara, the commander of the detachment. The notebook gave all the details of the Japanese plan to hold Segi. That night, Kennedy sent a radio message to Guadalcanal with the news. Strong enemy patrol has approached very close, and by their numbers and movement, it is believed they will attack. Urgently suggest force be sent to defend Segi. Admiral Turner responded by sending Lieutenant Colonel Michael S. Curran with Companies O and P of the 4th Marine Raider Battalion on the night of June 20 in the destroyers Dent and Waters. The raiders were to hold Segi Point, but the destroyers had some difficulty getting into these restricted waters, and both scraped bottom. Luckily, the bottom was mostly mud, and the most serious damage done was to the Dent's port propeller, which took a mauling. The raiders were landed just after 6 o'clock on the morning of June 21. 4 hours later, their defences were declared secure. On June 22, the destroyers Schley and Crosby brought 2 companies of the Army 103rd Infantry Regiment and a naval survey party that was to do the preliminary work for the building of the airstrip. The Japanese sent patrols around the island, but they were kept under watch by the Solomon Island soldiers, who reported every move to Coast Watcher Kennedy. The area was regarded as so secure that 4 days later, war correspondent Clay Gowron of the Chicago Tribune was brought into Segi aboard a PBY seaplane. On the evening of June 27, the Marines turned Segi Point over to the Army troops and moved off to begin the second part of their advance operation. They were to cross the 5-mile strait in rubber boats and land on New Georgia at Segi, then move overland to Viru Harbor, where they were to assault the small Japanese garrison. Allied intelligence indicated that the garrison consisted of about 100 men. There were actually 229. The Marines were to take possession to prepare for the official invading force, which was to land on June 30 from the sea. The advance unit landed in the early minutes of June 28 and bivouacked for the night. At 6:30 a.m., the Marines were going again, in single file, along the narrow jungle trail heading north across the mountains. 3 hours later, the rear guard encountered a Japanese patrol, and in the firefight that ensued, 4 Japanese were killed, and 1 or 2 escaped into the jungle. The Marines suffered no casualties, but it was apparent that they would not make Viru harbour by the morning of June 30 as they had hoped. They sent a message to Coast Watcher Kennedy back at Seggy Point to relay to Admiral Turner. 45 minutes later, the rear guard of the column was hit by a larger enemy patrol, this one armed with machine guns. The jungle became bedlam. When the noise of the firing subsided, Sergeant Sudrow and 4 men from Company P were missing. That night the raiders bivouacked on the Mohi River. At 6:30 the next morning they moved out again. The sergeant and the 4 men had not shown up. Again, at 11:15 a.m., the Japanese hit the rear guard. Lieutenant Brown's platoon took the worst of it. When the fight was over, 5 Marines were dead and 1 man was wounded. They counted 18 Japanese bodies. Lieutenant Colonel Currin decided to deal with the problem at the source. He detached Company P, except for the weapons platoon, to attack the village of Toom, where the Japanese were concentrated. Captain Walker was in command. With him were Lieutenant Popelka, Lieutenant Brown, and 100 men. At 9 o'clock on the morning of June 30, the main body crossed the Viru River, and the next morning it approached the village of Tetamara, the location of the Japanese garrison for Viru Harbour. Admiral Mitcher's Guadalcanal Air Force cooperated and sent dive bombers to plaster the village that morning. But even so, when the Marines came up, the Japanese were ready to fight, disposed before the village and out on both flanks. The Marines approached and the struggle began. This time Colonel Currin heard heavy machine gun fire. The Marines began to take casualties. After an hour they had advanced about 100 yards, and there they were stopped until the colonel moved machine guns forward. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the force managed to get around to the south and take possession of the ridge there, with a ravine on the right front. The Japanese sent out flanking forces. Colonel Currin sent demolition squads with satchel charges to both flanks to deal with the heavy machine guns that were beginning to harass the men again. At 3:30 p.m., the Japanese decided to charge the Marine position and began working themselves up to it with screams and yelling, "Marine, you die! Tenno Haika, Banzai!" But the assault failed, and half an hour later the Marines overran the enemy positions. At 4:30 that afternoon they had sole possession of Tetamara village, and at 5 p.m. the tank landing crafts of the invasion force landed. Colonel Currin brought in his 6 dead and 17 wounded Marines. They did not then count the dead Japanese. They assembled the captured equipment: 6 light .25 caliber Nambu machine guns, 4 .31 caliber machine guns, 6 field guns. Captain Walker and his men arrived from Toom to report no casualties, and they had killed a dozen Japanese. During the night, 2 of the wounded Marines died. The next day, a 30-man patrol sent out to mop up killed 2 more Japanese soldiers. On the 4th of July, the Americans had good news. Sergeant Sudrow and the 4 Marines missing after the first Japanese ambush had made it back to Seggy Point. From then until July 9, the Marines patrolled the area and killed several more Japanese soldiers. At 5:30 a.m. on July 9, they embarked in landing craft for Guadalcanal, turning Viru over to the army troops. The Marines had taken 28 casualties, 13 of them killed. In turn, they had killed 60 Japanese and wounded another 100. Most of the Japanese garrison escaped into the jungle and began working through the bush toward Munda. At Munda, the rains had begun in earnest on June 23. There it was fog and drizzle, but at Renova, where the northern part of the island is largely flat red clay plainland, the constant rains of the next few days created a quagmire, and everything was flooded. For 3 days at the end of June, the American bombers and fighters seemed to hover almost constantly over New Georgia and Kolombangara Islands. The airstrips at Villa and Munda were pitted from constant bombing, and no Japanese planes could get in during the daylight hours. Any trying to get out would have met a wall of gunfire. There was also a good deal of activity on the ground behind the Japanese lines, as advance United States parties moved in and out of the areas that would soon be attacked, in order to make plans for rapid build-up of the bases once the Japanese were driven out. This sort of movement was not as dangerous as it seemed, because the Japanese never controlled the entire islands, but only pockets where they built their bases. Guided and guarded by the coast watchers and their native troops, the Allied surveyors were relatively safe. On the night of June 29, Admiral Merrill brought his destroyers and cruisers to the shores of New Georgia to shell the Rakata Bay base and lay mines. Japanese headquarters at Truk and Rabaul knew what was coming before the troops did. On the night of June 29, the submarine Row 103 was patrolling west of the Russell Islands, when her captain sighted a large force of warships and transports moving northwest. They had to be heading for the Central Solomons. Still, the Japanese naval headquarters at Rabaul was caught off guard. On this same day, General MacArthur's troops were landing at Nassau Bay, 17 miles from Salamaua on New Guinea. At the same time, they were landing in the Trobriand Islands, off the New Guinea shore. The Allies were conducting an enormous troop build-up that did not go unnoticed at Rabaul. The problem was that there were too many rat holes to watch, and from the middle of June onward, the Japanese were aware of the danger from Guadalcanal. They knew that the Americans were poised for action, but the Japanese had planned their defences and their strategy, which called for concentration on New Guinea rather than the Solomons, and they made no attempts to change them. The Japanese were totally unaware of the first set of landings at Wickham Anchorage. Admiral Halsey wanted this location for a PT boat staging point, because the 300 Japanese on Vangunu Island, south of New Georgia, were located on high ground to the east of Wickham. 2 destroyers and 7 landing craft took part in this landing before dawn. The operation was badly managed. The craft got in the way of their own boats, and 6 of the boats were lost. If there had been any Japanese at Wickham Landing, the results might have been disastrous. Meanwhile, the main landing force was moving further northwest. Then on June 30, came the dawn at 4:45. At that moment the sun poked through the rain clouds. The visibility for a moment was perfect, and the Japanese defenders looking out on the leaden sea saw 6 transports and a whole fleet of boats facing Rendova's north point, about 3,000 yards out. The Allied invasion of the Middle Solomons had begun. It was just before 7 o'clock in the morning, United States military time. Actually, the first landings were made on 2 small islands that overlooked Blanche Channel, the waterway the transports would use to approach Rendova. The destroyer Talbot and the minesweeper Zane landed 2 companies of the 169th Infantry Regiment on these islands. There were no Japanese present, so the going was easy enough, except that the Zane ran up on the reef and stayed stuck until pulled off later that day by the tug rail. Then the shock troops, special jungle-trained men of the 172nd Regimental Combat Team, the Barracudas, were landed in the wrong place. Their mission was to land in Rendova harbour and wipe out the Japanese garrison before the main landing. But their ferryboats, the destroyers Dent and Waters, took them to the wrong place, and when they landed and found no Japanese, they were temporarily out of the fight. The other men of the 172nd Regimental Combat Team were put in the right place, without a doubt. They landed by the early light, and it was not long before the lost men of the first landing showed up. Since several thousand Americans had landed, to oppose fewer than 400 Japanese in total, the issue was never in doubt. In half an hour, the Americans were storming one point after another. It got down to hand-to-hand fighting. Almost immediately, Japanese communication between Munda and Rendova was cut off. Munda, of course, was next on the list that day. The Japanese had no way of combating the enemy concentration of ships and troops except in the air, but no Japanese aircraft appeared. From the lookout station atop the point, the defenders of Munda watched what was happening across the strait. Munda Cape housed half a dozen Navy 12-centimetre and 14-centimetre guns, and these began firing on the enemy ships. The command ship and transport Macaulay and the destroyers Dent and Waters landed the first waves of troops to hit Rendova's beach. They were the targets of the Munda guns. The destroyer Gwyn was hit in the aft engine room by a shell from a shore gun. 3 men were killed and 7 were wounded. Immediately the Gwyn began making smoke to screen the transports from the shore guns. The warships found the sources of shore fire, and one by one the batteries were silenced. By 8 o'clock United States time, all of the Japanese shore batteries on Munda Cape were knocked out. Ashore on Rendova, the fighting was furious but brief. The Japanese garrison seemed at first to be confused, but a young naval officer, Lieutenant Sender, seized command and led the men in fighting to the last. It was an uneven contest. How uneven is shown by one small event. A boat returned to the Macaulay, carrying one wounded soldier, the sum total of United States casualties that could be rounded up. At 8 o'clock that morning the fighting was over on Renova. A handful of Japanese escaped into the jungle. From the naval and army commands at Rabaul came an order to withdraw from Renova. It was picked up at Munda, and a bugler blew 3 blasts to tell the survivors on Renova that their mission was finished. Still no help had come for the Japanese. At that moment at Rabaul there were 71 Zeros, 20 dive bombers, 41 torpedo bombers, and 5 scout planes available. And because there were 2 landings in 2 widely separated parts of an extremely broad front facing the Rabaul command, New Guinea and the Central Solomons, Admiral Kusaka's 11th Air Fleet could respond to the American landing only with a fighter sweep. At 9 o'clock Tokyo time that morning, 27 Zeros got off the ground and headed for Renova. The first indication of their arrival came at 11 o'clock, when the task force off Renova went to battle stations in response to a report of bogies coming in. A few minutes later, the Japanese fighters were engaged in an air battle with a larger group of American fighters from Guadalcanal, somewhere between 30 and 40 fighters. The fighting was carried out at high altitude, 21,000 feet above the invasion fleet, and not much was seen from the water or the ground. But the Allies, Americans and New Zealanders had the best of it, claiming 16 Zeros. Several Allied planes were shot down, and one pilot was rescued by a boat from the Macaulay. The destroyer Buchanan picked up 2 more pilots. By noon, Admiral Kusaka had his bombers armed and ready to make a major attack on the American invasion force, with 24 fighters and 26 twin-engine Mitsubishi Betty bombers fitted for torpedo world. The Japanese came down the slot to Renova Harbour, but found that the invasion fleet had landed its troops and supplies, and moved off, heading back toward the relative safety of Guadalcanal. The American fighter cover over Renova began trailing the force and sniping at the tail-end Charlies, and managed to pick off a few. But just after 3:30 in the afternoon, United States time, general quarters was sounded aboard the Macaulay. The Japanese were closing fast. Up above, 41 American fighters moved to intercept. The Japanese followed their usual tactics. The fighters lured and engaged the American fighters, while the torpedo bombers tried to get down under the screen to attack the ships. Some of the American F-4Fs and F-4Us managed to come down with the bombers and shot down at least 5 of them by Admiral Turner's count. The torpedo bombers bored in on the invasion fleet, splitting into small attack units so they could approach from different directions. At 3:50, Admiral Turner ordered the ships to begin firing. 3 minutes later, he ordered an emergency 90-degree right turn. Several torpedo planes headed for the flagship, the Macaulay, and dropped their torpedoes as they came in. The captain of the Macaulay, Commander Robert H. Rogers, was already in the 90-degree turn ordered by Admiral Turner, but he made another 90-degree turn inside that to try to comb the wakes of the torpedoes. He almost made it, but not quite. One torpedo struck the Macaulay amidships, just as the gunners were shooting down 2 of the torpedo bombers. The ship began to list to port and went dead in the water, and the reports from the damage control centre indicated that the engine room was flooded. With their ship lying helpless, the men of the Macaulay watched in horror as another torpedo headed directly for the disabled flagship. But the torpedo ran just alongside the ship, from stern to stem, and sank just beyond the bow. From their grandstand seat, the men of the Macaulay watched the rest of the attack. From the American point of view, it was very satisfying. 17 of the attacking bombers were shot down, and no ships other than the Macaulay were hit. Admiral Turner was taken off the stricken ship by the destroyer Fahrenheit, and Rear Admiral T.S. Wilkinson, his second-in-command, remained aboard the command ship to try to salvage her. 15 men had been killed and 8 wounded by the torpedo explosion, and the wounded were transferred. The Macaulay was taken in tow by the transport Libra. Later that day, the tow was transferred to the tug Pawnee, which had a difficult time of it and lost the tow that night. While Admiral Turner was considering the problem, something came out of the night and put 2 torpedoes into the Macaulay. There was no further need to worry about a tow. She went down to join the scores of other ships sunk in these embattled waters. Later, to the chagrin of all concerned, the commander of the local PT boats came into port boasting of the sinking of an enemy transport in Blanche Channel that night.